talk about what the environment is like, what you can expect. And to lead us through all of this is Jinxon. I'm so sorry, I'm stumbling over my words today. Do you want to give us a little introduction to yourself and then jump right into the slides?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jinxon. I am an account manager and scientific recruiter at Recruitomics Consulting. Before I was at Recruitomics, I worked in academic research and worked briefly at a startup in biotech. And now I'm here and really excited to talk about biotech industries. All right, so to start with, biotech industry work environment. So my point of view is going to be coming from my experience where I worked at a very small biotech in LA. All right. So to start with, the work environment at a biotech industry can really vary depending on the specific company. So some of us are coming from academic research where we work a lot on fundamental research. And when you transition into biotech, typically you have some kind of product, whether that's a therapy or a life science tool or something in diagnostics that you're bringing to market. So when you're looking at a biotech, you're looking at research that's a lot more focused than what you might be used to coming from an academic environment. But there's several factors that are definitive of an industry work environment, whether you're coming from a big biotech or small biotech. So something that you see a lot in biotechs is interdisciplinary collaboration. So when you're working on taking a product to market, what you need are a lot of different brains in different fields. So you'll see folks from biology, chemistry, engineering, computer science, people who are really going to work at the intersection of all of that to develop innovative solutions and products, because science doesn't happen in a vacuum. And what you end up doing in biotech is working on a lot of cross-disciplinary teams. All right, so as I mentioned, interdisciplinary research is really important in biotech. In my experience, I've worked with folks in biology, folks who have experience with chemistry, chemical engineering. It is not uncommon for people who come from these STEM fields to also have experience in computer science or, say, computational biology, and to bring all of that together into collaboration for different functional units. So when you're at a biotech, depending on the size, you can often have discovery, clinical, and manufacturing departments all working together, because communication between departments is really important to make sure everyone is on the same page to take that product to market or to advance the science. Just as I mentioned, so you have scientists and engineers, often coming from academia. If you're working in chemical engineering, you will be at the intersection of, say, chemistry, biology, and engineering, depending on your product. Sometimes it's a diagnostic, sometimes it's a therapeutic. You will be working with clinicians or regulatory experts, especially if it's a drug that you're bringing to market, and other professionals. While we're scientists and we're experts in the science and how to actually innovate, we often need to consult with clinicians or physicians, just other experts in fields outside of our own, to make sure that the product we're delivering is actually something that's going to be viable in the real world. All right, so lab-centric. So biotech work, very much like an academic lab, is going to take place in a laboratory. And anytime you work in a laboratory, lab safety is really important. Documentation, especially, is of the utmost importance. These are things that we already learn when we're doing our education in our STEM fields, but something we come across when we're going into biotech are GXP regulations. So when we're doing fundamental research in an academic lab, we're not thinking about regulatory bodies as much. But when you think about making a product, say a therapeutic, that has to be delivered to people at some point. You have to think about manufacturing and how those things are really highly regulated, because you need uniformity in your product. You need something that works from start to finish. And documentation is super important, because everything you do in a biotech atmosphere needs to be reproducible by scientists that come before you and after you. And speaking on that, proper lab techniques and safety, that's really important in any lab you work in, whether that's academic or biotech. But when you enter into industry and you're making products, it's really important that everything is up to code. When you're dealing with GXP regulations or say the FDA, documentation and regulatory compliance are really important. When I was in biotech, we worked with electronic records. So when you're moving to an organization where everyone is so collaborative, and say a biotech where I worked in, which was less than 10 people, you typically wear a lot of hats, and people are so collaborative that it's really important that someone is able to look at your notes and be able to reproduce the work you're doing or to understand what you're doing from a quick glance. So electronic records were super important to be able to share with the entire company and to keep those notes completely up to date. And fast-paced and dynamic. So coming from academia, going into biotech research, I will say that when I was in academia, we did a lot more of fundamental research. You sort of had that time to explore lots of different avenues of scientific questions. You would have a main project, and then you would have small side projects. And something that's a little different about biotech is that you are delivering a product, as I mentioned, whether that's a therapeutic, a tool, or a diagnostic. So your projects are much larger, but they're much more focused. And because they're much more focused, you also have to pay attention to the rapid innovation and change in the field. And part of that is making sure that you're staying updated on the latest developments. So in terms of biotech, that's keeping abreast of new scientific innovations in your field. You could make sure you're up to date on the news, though a lot of times by the time something goes public, it's already been happening for quite some time. Something I actually did was keep abreast of the patents that were coming out or IPs that were filed, whether that was like a provisional or a published patent, because a lot of times when tech isn't public yet or announced in the news, there is intellectual property being filed. And so a lot of my work was looking at the IP at other places, what companies were innovating. And then in terms of discoveries and breakthroughs, that goes hand in hand with keeping on top of innovations and how they have significant impacts on your companies and the industry. So where I was working, I was at a biotech where we were working on innovating glucose responsive insulins. So my job while working there was to make sure that I was keeping on top of what sort of artificial insulins were on the market, what kind of breakthroughs there were, whether people had new inventions in that field, because other inventions impact your own workflow. And if you're thinking about delivering a product, it impacts where you can see your work in the market. And hand in hand with that comes with updating methodologies and protocols. So if you're, say, developing a therapeutic, like a gene therapy, as we innovate with science, there's always new ways to make your product, whether that's a new scientific protocol, a new assay, or a way of innovating. It's really important to keep abreast of that because the technology is always moving forward and faster and faster. Biotech companies, much like any kind of other research, are focused on experimentation and data analysis to create new drugs, therapies, diagnostics, or life science tools. Biotech companies are often spun out of academic labs, and innovation is really driven by the initial research in labs. So it goes hand in hand that by the time you transition to industry, you're still putting a heavy focus on good experimentation and data analysis to push your science forward. Problem solving, much like any sort of research, is a key aspect of the work. The ability to take a project from start to finish. And then when you're innovating, you have to be ready to do unconventional thinking, try new ideas, try things that maybe are crazy and you think they're not going to work, but it's worth a try. A lot of times when you are at a biotech and you're innovating something new, you're at the forefront of the research where you don't have the answers and no one else does. So what you really have to do is ask the key questions and design the experiments to innovate that product. And regulatory challenges. So when I was in biotech, we were at an early stage and we didn't deal with regulatory bodies. We weren't yet at the stage of clinical trials and approvals. But from my experience working in talent management with biotech companies of lots of different sizes, working with regulatory bodies such as the FDA, working on clinical trials are really challenging and really important when you're thinking of taking a drug from concept to feasibility into something that's actually going to be presented to patients. Things like clinical trials are really highly regulated to make sure things are ethical and above board. And when you think about a product that eventually has to go out into the public, it has to pass all of the FDA regulations. So compliance and making sure that you're up to date with regulation is really important. So in terms of startups versus established companies, so I was working at a startup, and startups are small, they're different from established companies. And what you'll find is that when you are at a startup, typically something maybe from 10 to 50 people, you wear a lot of different hats, especially if it's a brand new startup and everyone's hitting the ground running. It could be a lot of interdisciplinary work, definitely a lot of collaboration. When you are on a small team, everyone is relying on each other to drive the research forward. So communication is important everywhere, but with startups, you might find that things are at a much faster pace than an established company. You have metrics to meet initially to secure funding. As I mentioned, you wear a lot of different hats. So when I was at a startup, I was doing things like instrument maintenance, but I was also leading experiments. We were also keeping abreast of all of the documentation and then training junior members or training folks who were coming in for internships. And maybe at a bigger company, you would focus on 1 or 2 sole projects, but at a startup, you're really doing anything and everything that they need your hands to do because you're supporting your whole team, which is very small. And then in terms of flexibility, as I mentioned, startups, there might be more flexibility there. You have a faster paced environment, but because it's small and you don't have as many different departments, you get a greater involvement in aspects of business. You get a bigger stake in driving your scientific ideas forward. So where I worked, you were less than 10 people. And so we all worked really closely together to strategize the science. And at a place that's that small, your voice and your ideas carry a lot of weight. And what's cool is that you actually get to take your ideas and try them out. Whereas at a bigger company, you might not have that time or space to do so. And ethical considerations. This goes a lot hand in hand with the clinical trials and regulations. When you are considering biopharmaceuticals, genetic engineering, say you have gene therapy or any sort of small molecule drug to treat an indication, there's ethical considerations that play a significant role. And this can come into clinical trials, the population that you're testing, making sure that everything is ethical and above board when you're running those clinical trials. Yep. And professionals in biotech. So we do always need to consider questions related to bioethics, patient privacy. And this is when you're, again, really getting into clinical trials. So when you've done all of the discovery in lab, you've done the innovation, and you have a product and you're ready to test it on the population. There is a lot of review and compliance that goes into establishing a clinical trial. And there's a lot of moving bodies in biotech who deal with this. So you have your clinical trial managers, your clinical trial associates, people who are coordinating, people who are taking care of, say, IRB, which is the internal review board, to review the guidelines of your study before you take a project to clinic. And then continuous learning. So this is something that's important in any sort of research field, but especially in biotech. This really goes hand in hand with how fast-paced biotech is. As I mentioned, keeping abreast of the news that's coming out, keeping an eye on the IP that you see being filed. Because sometimes before a company, whether big or small, comes out with a product, there is a patent that they filed detailing some of what goes into that product. So if you can do some of your research there and keep abreast of it and continually learn, it gives you a touch point on where the technology is at any given moment. And then one of the last things, but not any less important, is to travel to conferences and professional events. So when I was a student, I went to a lot of different conferences in the STEM field. And what you will often find are speakers who are giving seminars alongside the academics. And so you will have companies, no name dropping, but companies who go to, say, small research conferences, and they pitch slides on the drugs that they're innovating and the indications that they're treating and what accomplishments they've made. So if you go to those places, it's great to meet other experts in the biotech field. Conferences are great to see the intersection of academic and biotech discourse, to see where things are in terms of fundamental research and then how that's being translated to an actual product in the industry. All right, and that's the end of the show, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. That was a really great overview. And your experience sounds really interesting working in a small biotech.
Yeah.
Yeah, really cool. So we haven't had any questions come in yet, but there is still time. So anyone who's watching who wants to send a question in, please feel free. In the meantime, one of my questions, I think we always sort of touch on how to get the information. So at what point during the interview stage would you suggest that people start kind of asking about the specific culture and the sort of vibe of the biotech that they're thinking about joining? Like you said, they're all sort of different. They all have some similarities, but do you have any tips for, when is it a good time to think about talking about what a specific place of employment looks like?
Yeah, it really depends on the size of the company. So when I was interviewing for a small biotech, you didn't have, say, a recruiter or talent acquisition team working with you. So your very first phone call or your phone screen is with someone at the company. So maybe that's their COO, their CEO, or even a senior scientist on the team. So it really depends on the size of the company. I would encourage you to do your research beforehand. If it's a company of 25 or less employees, maybe your first interview is going to be directly with someone on the team. And that's a great place to ask. Like, you do your initial interview and they'll ask you, do you have any questions? And that first call is a great time to ask, what is the culture of the company like? But if you're looking at a bigger company, so some of the biotechs we support are a little bigger. They're 50 to 100 people, and we are, doing the initial phone screens. So we can tell you about the culture, but it's a little difficult for us to tell you about what it's like day in and day out with your boots on the ground. So if you've done your research and you know the sort of size of the company, you can hold those questions at the beginning. But if you get moved to a hiring manager interview or even team interviews, that's a great place to ask those questions and assess the culture with people who are there day in and day out, because they'll have much more detailed, informative answers for you.
And now some people rely really heavily on Glassdoor.
Mm-hmm.
In your experience, what are your thoughts on Glassdoor in terms of people talking about, their experiences? Go all in or grain of salt?
I would really take Glassdoor with a grain of salt. Anytime you have these social media platforms, and this is something I've observed with people, who are the voices who are likely to go on Glassdoor and leave a review? I think it's very polarized, right? You tend to either have someone who leaves a very glowing review or someone who had, say, a negative interview experience, and they really just go all in with the low ratings and very harsh words. So, I mean, I would take it with a grain of salt, definitely read it over. But I'm in my experience, I've never trusted the star rating on reviews on Glassdoor 100%, because if they're all completely negative, I do have to wonder, is it just a couple of disgruntled people who are going on and leaving reviews? Or if it's completely positive and that's all you see, well, you're like, is that really possible? So yes, definitely do your research, but I wouldn't say 100% trust that as the law.
Yeah, I've seen people use it in a really interesting way, which is you read the reviews and pull out some facets of things that maybe are either alarming, or if there's one theme that comes up over and over, and then you can ask about that specific thing. You can say, okay, I've seen some people reference XYZ online. Can you speak to that? And maybe that gives you a little bit of a lead in for asking a specific culture question. Um, your
That's
mileage may
just
vary, but yeah.
And it
Um,
really depends on what it is, right? Like I would definitely ask with tact, not go in and say, hey, I read this, and then, quote something verbatim if it's a very acidic comment or something.
Yeah, no, totally. I think judgment is key on that one. But all these great tools that do kind of give you some type of a glimpse into what working in a biotech is like. But again, use your judgment, and you can always think of a strategic way to get the information, but maybe face value isn't everything. Um, well, I think, we haven't had any questions come in, but that's okay, because you can always find us in the Collaboratory Career Hub Slack channel, or Slack community, I should say. And so if you'd like to join us there, we will drop the link below, and you can ask us all of your questions about what it's like to work in a biotech. All of the Recruitomics team is in there, so we can pull in all sorts of experience, but we are always happy to answer any questions you have. So thank you for joining us for Ask the Recruiter. Jingson, thank you so much. You were fantastic, and it was great catching up with you and hearing all things biotech.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.